Hello, I'm Martyn Iles. Welcome to Voice for Values. Well, in the building right behind me here, Parliament House in Canberra, euthanasia was defeated against the odds just a couple of weeks ago. And that's despite us looking at the numbers in the early days and saying this is going to pass easily. Well, once we got into conversations with politicians and once doctors showed up, they changed their minds very quickly, one by one. How is it so easy to have that conversation once we look at euthanasia, particularly around the world? Well, I have that conversation on Voice for Values this week with long-standing Member of Parliament and Minister in successive governments, Kevin Andrews. Last week we saw in the Senate the Territories' Rights Bill, which would have allowed euthanasia legislation to be passed in the ACT and the Northern Territory, and as we know now, would be almost guaranteed that that would have happened if the Territory Rights Bill had passed the Senate. That was blocked by a majority of just 2, so if one person had changed their vote, that would have been deadlocked in the Senate, and who knows where the President would have gone. Your reflections on that, on the last couple of weeks of lobbying around that and the lead up to that vote?
What I think was the important thing, Martin, was the fact that once legislators were exposed to medical experts, to doctors who had experience in the field of palliative care, of looking after people who have terminal illness, when their experiences are part of the conversation, then the immediate sort of emotive, oh well, this isn't okay, starts to get questioned and people start to look at what's really happening and the potential for things that are important like palliative care, rather than just saying, well, we'll allow a person to commit suicide with the assistance of a doctor and the state.
And that's a common experience, isn't it? Once the experts get in front of politicians, and I've seen this as well played out at federal and state levels in the past, when the politicians begin to hear the experts, they actually start to shift in their understanding. What do you think is driving that shift?
My observation is that the overwhelming cause of thinking for many members of Parliament is sentiment or emotion.
Right.
By that I mean, if you listen to speeches about topics like euthanasia and other life issues, people relate their own experiences. Somebody who died, somebody who was cared for, and that emotive response seems to be at the front of mind for many people initially. But that's not what it's all about. It's about how we make laws which are going to be appropriate and laws which ultimately will protect the most vulnerable in our community. And when people are then exposed to what the reality is, it's a check, if you like, a counterpoint to what their emotive situation might be in the first place, and they think a bit more deeply about it. They come to realise that there's a range of possibilities in the way in which people can be cared for, both psychologically and physically.
So it's really an emotive issue, and that's why the disparate opinions and the possible change. We see that on a lot of issues.
Yes, sentiment is, it seems to me, has become the overwhelming force in the society in which we live. People express their views about particular topics, their support for or whether they're against something, based initially on their sentimental or emotive reaction.
This is a little closer to you, this issue, than for many, because when it comes to the fact of the Northern Territory and the ACT not being able to legislate for euthanasia within their own territories, that is a result of a bill that was passed previously through the Parliament here in Canberra, the federal Parliament, and that's a bill that was introduced by yourself back in 1996. Why did you do that? Why did you take away, or why did you introduce a bill that would take away the Territory's rights to legislate for euthanasia?
Well, in 1996, the Northern Territory passed legislation which would allow for euthanasia. I looked at that legislation and I thought you could drive a truck through it in terms of the ability to be able to, frankly, allow anybody to be assisted in committing suicide.
Really open slather.
It was very open slather, but worse than that, this was one territory with a population of just a couple of 100,000 people, effectively opening the door to euthanasia throughout Australia. And as we saw, in the time frame between the Northern Territory bill being passed and my bill passing the Commonwealth Parliament to override it, in that period I think of about 9 months, people were killed in the Northern Territory who weren't residents of the Northern Territory. I mean, there's the famous case of Mr Dent, who drove thousands of kilometres to the Northern Territory in order to make use of the legislation there. So effectively the Northern Territory was legislating for all of Australia. My belief was that the Commonwealth Parliament should have a say about that, and because the Constitutional original founders of Australia had put a provision in the Constitution which said that the territories are subject to the Commonwealth. They're a creation of the Commonwealth, and the Commonwealth can, if it desires to, override territory laws.
Now, at that time, the Northern Territory was one of the first jurisdictions to have euthanasia laws in the entire world. And there was one guy in particular, wasn't there, who actually, I think, carried out all of the euthanasia cases in the Northern Territory, the 5 or 6 that took place, Dr. Philip Nitschke. Now, he is an advocate for euthanasia, but what is it about his advocacy then and now which gives you cause for concern about the euthanasia community?
Well, Dr. Nitschke, I think, was completely radical in terms of his libertarian philosophy. I debated Dr. Nitschke on many occasions back in 1996-97, both in the media and in public fora, and it seemed to me that Philip Nitschke thought that anybody in any circumstance who wanted assistance to bring about their own death should be entitled to have it. There was no limitation in terms of his thinking in relation to what the condition of the person might be. I mean, yes, he abided by the Northern Territory law whilst it was in place, but he was advocating a much more radical approach than even in the Northern Territory.
So assisted suicide on demand.
That's right. And what we've seen around the world is that gradually, where jurisdictions have introduced this sort of legislation, even with safeguards, over time those safeguards are watered down.
Well, the argument then is because you have advocates that keep pushing, and because you get those safeguards slowly eroding, the advocates here would say, no, we'll be different. In Australia, we'll have a different set of circumstances. We'll put really strong and robust safeguards in place, and they won't be broken down. But I suppose, to my mind, the recent case of Dr. David Goodall is a warning bell on that, because Dr. David Goodall went to Switzerland in order to obtain euthanasia, where he died. And it was Philip Nitschke who put out a comment on that at the time, supporting it. And for Dr. Goodall, the only thing that was wrong with him was that he was old. He had no other health problems. He was perfectly fit for a man of his age. But he was old and he died. And the media have used that case as a platform to advocate for euthanasia or to tell a positive story about euthanasia because the man was old. Now, they seem to be a few steps down the slippery slope then already, and they're betraying that in their coverage.
Yes. And if you look at the experience not just in Switzerland, but look at what's happened, for example, in Belgium, the Netherlands, there's recent cases of children now being given euthanasia. There are cases where people are asking for euthanasia, assisted suicide, for conditions like blindness or incontinence. And we've even had Senator Lyle here, who was seeking to overturn my bill, my legislation, saying that people should be able to be assisted in dying where their lives are unsatisfactory. So that's a long way from what the proponents claim in terms of strict safeguards in the first place. And as I said, the experience around the world is gradually those safeguards are broken down bit by bit by bit to what you're getting in some cases now is virtually assisted suicide on demand for no particular reason except that the person doesn't want to live.
So let's just clarify then that in, say, Belgium and the Netherlands, where you have child euthanasia, in Belgium, children of any age, where you have cases of blindness and incontinence receiving euthanasia, mental health as well, people who are depressed receiving euthanasia, whereas we used to give them sort of suicide support hotlines. You have all of those things taking place there, but that represents a departure from what the law said when it first came in those jurisdictions. There have been those steady changes over time as advocates continue to chip away.
Yes.
So that's what's taken place. What is it about the removal of a fundamental principle? I mean, is it because we've removed a fundamental principle? So we used to say that life is sacred, the sanctity of life reigns supreme, so you can never intentionally take a life. But once you remove that principle, is it then the search for another principle to stop these slow changes that is the problem?
Two things. Firstly, the arguments that are being used here that this would be an inevitable consequence were used in countries like Belgium and the Netherlands. Right. And it was said at the time, no, that's just a slippery slope argument. It's not real, it won't happen. Well, it's no longer a slippery slope argument in theory, it's in actuality as to what has happened. It's evidence-based now. So we're in a much stronger position in terms of the argument to say, if you do this, this will happen. Coming to the point about the boundaries, once you accept that each individual person has not got an inherent dignity, is not entitled to the same freedoms as everybody else, then any lines you draw around life, I believe, become arbitrary. And once you have arbitrary lines, well, those arbitrary lines can be changed. If you start from the principle that each of us is unique and each of us has an inherent dignity that should be upheld and protected, then that boundary is one which is quite firm. And we say, as a consequence of that in the law, that if you intentionally seek to bring about a person's death, then that will be punished by the law. So that intentionality has been a foundation stone, if you like, of both the common law and the broader law for centuries now, and this is being undermined by this type of legislation.
So let's pick up on that theme then of a person having inherent dignity, because we often see the language of dignity co-opted by those who would be pushing for euthanasia laws. So they say this is a dignified death. And let's tap also into the emotive arguments, which we mentioned earlier, where they'll say, well, clearly you haven't had a loved one who has suffered for many months and has had an undignified, painful death. Euthanasia means they can die with dignity. In other words, they can die with some measure of control. How do you contrast then the understanding of dignity there, and why is their argument wrong?
Well, I believe this is a false argument about dignity. It's co-opting a notion which is entirely different. It's about the convenience of the people surrounding the person who might seek euthanasia, and it's about convenience rather than about inherent dignity of the person concerned. And again, I ask the question, even though the language of dignity is being co-opted, what dignity is there for this person is concerned? Surely there's more dignity in providing care and support, providing counselling, providing palliative services, etc. That's something which actually provides for the ongoing dignity of the person, not simply ending their life.
And you mentioned there the convenience of all involved. Is that a real concern then, that if the option of ending a life exists, and there is the question of convenience, it is in many ways inconvenient, and many people report feeling like a burden when they're unwell, when they're elderly. Does that sense of convenience play a role in almost pressuring people?
Indeed. Human nature is human nature. As Solzhenitsyn said, the line between good and evil is not between you and me or between people. It's a line, in each of us that we have to make choices. Yeah. And, many years ago I practiced as a lawyer. I was an associate to a Supreme Court judge, and I saw cases where people were fighting over the wills of relatives in order to get more of the estate from their deceased parent, usually. Mm-hmm. That's an example of where human nature is such, where people will seek these things out, and it's quite clear that there will be circumstances where some people at least will say, well, it'd be better off if mum or dad's dead because we can inherit the house more quickly, or I can use the money or whatever, and they're just a burden on themselves, and by the way, wouldn't it be more dignified if they were just able to go?
Yeah, and people will say, well, of course, we'd never do that, we're very good. But as you say, that temptation is going to exist.
And I'm not saying that this is the case for everybody, far from it. I'm just saying that just like there are some people who will fight tooth and nail unreasonably over an estate, there will be some people who will be tempted and fall for the temptation of saying, isn't it better off that, mum's, allowed to succumb, is allowed to die with dignity, and by the way, that just means that, the property can be divided up a bit more quickly than it would have otherwise been, and it's not going to be a burden both in terms of the person concerned, but also in the financial burden on the family of continuing to keep the person in care.
I feel we can't finish the conversation without making some comment about how that the act of euthanasia or assisted suicide fundamentally changes the practice of medicine. It has long been a fundamental tenet of medicine that to kill somebody cannot possibly be a valid form of care. Now, to change that idea, to say, well, actually intentionally hastening a death or intentionally killing a person it is valid in the whole architecture of care in the medical profession. There must be deep psychological changes that take place in the way medicine is practiced in a community once we allow that, once we make that call.
Yes. If you change the culture so that assisting someone in their death is an option, and I draw a distinction between allowing somebody to die from natural causes. I mean, we know people, for example, who've said, I don't want another round of chemotherapy. I find that that's just burdensome, it would be futile, and we care for that person. The difference here is that if you give someone a lethal injection and they don't die, presumably you give them another lethal injection because you want to bring about their death. Whereas if you take someone off some form of support, a respirator, or you go along with caring for a person who doesn't want a further round of chemotherapy, you're not intending to bring about their death. You're allowing the disease, the illness, to actually take its course whilst providing all the care that you can in the meantime. So there's a big difference here. And from cultural perspective, if the culture of medical practice changes so that one of the options now is to assist a person to die, that obviously has a psychological impact in terms of the individual doctors and nurses themselves, but it also changes the whole culture of a profession, which, going right back to the Greek Hippocratic days, had always maintained that helping a person to live was the primary purpose of medicine, and assisting them in dying and bringing about their death in this active way was not something which was part of medicine.
Kevin Andrews, great to get your insights on the euthanasia issue. Very insightful. Thanks for joining me.
My pleasure.